Okay, so we're finally in Maya 2017. It's been quite a while, but I've really been looking forward to looking at the new version of the software. And today I'm going to be taking you guys through a very basic tutorial, and this is going to be the first day in Maya. If you've never used Maya before, or you've just opened it up for the first time, this is what you see on your screen. This wonderful menu which floats here, which you can turn off by turning off this little menu over here. And inside of Maya, you've got a huge potential for making amazing 3D scenes, producing assets for games or for images or for anything that you can come up with. It's a big program, there's a lot of stuff in there, but in day one, what I want to teach you guys is just a little view into the different things that you can do in Maya. Everything's going to be really quick, but today's all about getting you guys comfortable with the interface, what can you do with it, and hopefully walk away with making a little small 3D scene that you can render out as a still frame or as an animation. There'll be some stuff here for people who have already used Maya 2016 as well. I'll be talking a little bit about using Arnold as the new default render inside of Maya 2017, which is absolutely great. I'll also be showing you a little bit of the new type tool as well, and some of the considerations that you should have when using shaders and other stuff as well that will become very familiar to you. For those of you who are just starting for the first time, I really appreciate doing three things inside of Maya, and that is modeling, lighting, and texturing. Those should be the three things that you should be able to learn how to do fairly quickly and with great dexterity. I'm also going to talk a little bit about animating things with some of the new tools which are inside of Maya, but you're going to see that it's going to be quite a breeze. So everything's going to be very quick, and I'm also going to go into very little detail just so that you guys can touch on just a few things so that you can feel like you're making a good 3D scene. So the first thing that we're going to do is inside of Maya, we've got a whole host of tools. I'm going to be working in specific sections. And over here on the top, we've got the shelf. All of these icons are different 3D objects that you can create. And most of the time, there'll be little polygon primitives like this, these spheres, cubes, planes, and other stuff like that. And one of the options that we've got here is also type. I'm going to start off by showing you guys first of all that you can create objects by going into the menus up here, or you can be using the shelf. Maya has at least 2 or 3 ways of doing exactly the same thing because it's designed for artists and technical people alike to work in the way that they want to. So there's really no difference between using the menus up here, using the shelf up here. If I hold down spacebar on my keyboard and I'm on this viewport over here, there's going to be this pop-up hotbox over here, which is all of the menu items appearing on the display. So these are exactly the same as this stuff up here. When you're a beginner, try to experiment a little bit and just learn one way of doing things. So if I want to create some text here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the Create menu, and over here I've got a new type tool. And anything that's new in Maya appears with a green outline over here, and that will be between the versions. That's how we find what's new in here. Now, first of all, my screen will be full up with this 3D text, which is over here. There's been a few things that have changed, but inside this viewport over here, that's where all of my 3D scene actually lives. And actually by default, this is written out as 3D type. What's going to happen is that I can't see all of these words. So one of the first key skills that you need to learn is how to move around in the viewport. Now, it's important that when you're working in Maya, you're either using a graphics tablet, like myself, but most of you guys will be using a mouse. Now, it's important that the mouse that you're using is actually a 3-button mouse, like this one over here. If you don't have 3 buttons, you're going to find that it's impossible to work inside of Maya because you need those 3 buttons for controlling the navigation properties. Now, if you are actually using a mouse and you press the Alt key on your keyboard and use your left mouse button and drag on the viewport, you're going to see that you are orbiting the camera tool over here, like so. The next thing that's going to happen is if I start dragging the middle mouse button, that's the mouse wheel, you'll see that I'm capable of panning with the actual camera like that. And if I right click, still holding down the Alt key all the time, I can zoom in and I can zoom out of my 3D object like this. If I press the actual F key on the keyboard, it's going to frame or focus in on the object that I have in my scene. So if my object's really tiny, like this, and I press F, it's going to zoom in there. If I'm too close to it so I can't see it, and I press F, it's going to zoom out like this as well. So any type of 3D object that we have in our scene is going to have some basic properties. And we can also not only move the camera around, but we also should be thinking about moving our 3D objects around in space. To do that, we have a series of tools to manipulate normally the position, rotation, and scale of our 3D objects. These are 3 generic commands that we use all of the time. And Maya structures this little toolbox menu on the left-hand side of the screen over here, where there is the Move tool, the Rotate tool, and the Scale tool as well. Now, normally to see properties, Maya does everything with very clever maths and programming in the background. And over here on the left hand side, if I click on this tab that's floating over here, you'll see that we've got this menu here which is called the channel box. Now the channel box lists some basic parameters of 3D space. Everything in Maya has 3 main coordinates: an X coordinate, a Z coordinate, and a Y coordinate. So when I'm moving objects around in 3D space, I should see some changes appearing inside of these properties over here inside the channel box. Now, first of all, let's talk about the Move tool. Now, the Move tool is made up of this little transform gizmo, and again, I'm using my Alt key to get closer to the transform gizmo. This is just the pivot of where the object is placed within my scene. So all of my 3D type over here actually has 0 coordinates on the X, Y, and Z. This is like the home point inside of my Maya scene. Now, these axes, these little arrows, represent the directions that I can move things in 3D space. And the transform gizmo requires you to just click on the right part. It's very easy as a beginner to get things wrong, but don't worry about that. If I drag on this red arrow over here and left click and drag, you're going to see that I create a movement in the X axes up here. And if I click on my object again to select it, drag up in this green arrow over here, you see that I'm creating movement in the Y axis. And if I drag on the blue one, well, there's nothing else left except the Z axis over here. Now, it's important that if you click off an object in Maya, the transform gizmo disappears, because this gray background means that nothing is selected. If I select the type by clicking on it, you'll see the transform gizmo appears again, and I can keep moving things around. Control Z, or Command Z if you're on a Mac, is your best friend, because you can always undo all of the movements and all of the selections inside of Maya. And Maya will allow you to undo any type of operation, with the exception of undoing your camera moves. So those ones have a special button for them that I'll talk about in a future tutorial. Now, moving one axis at a time isn't a lot of fun. Maya actually has a few extra little tools inside the transform gizmo, and if I look very close here, you'll see that there's this green little square and a blue little square and a red little square there, which allow me to actually constrain my movements to different planes. If I grab this green square over here and I drag my mouse along the screen by left clicking like this, you're going to see that the text always remains at the same height. And actually, if you look very closely at the channel box, you'll see that there's 2 numbers fluttering around in space like this. This is because I am constraining my type to move in a specific direction like this. So very useful for moving 2 things for moving objects along a plane, because you're really moving 2 axes at a time faster than just dragging one axis and another like that. Now, there's a third way of moving things around as well with the transform gizmo, which is this little square over here. Notice that it highlights yellow when my mouse goes over it. What happens is if I grab the middle part of the transform gizmo, I'm performing a movement that is parallel to the camera. I'm going to use a little tool in Maya here just to illustrate this for a sec, and I'm going to come into here, use this grease pencil tool, which is really handy because it allows me to draw on screen. If you imagine a 3D camera just like this, okay, that's what we're looking through in Maya, and here is my 3D text. This is how I saw it from the side. This is the field of view of the camera. When I'm grabbing that middle section, it's moving the type parallel to the actual plane of the camera. So it's never getting closer or further away from the camera. It's always moving in front of the camera like my hand's doing right now. So I'm just going to take this, delete that little grease pencil tool, hide it away. And what I'm going to do now is again select my type over here one more time. So 3 different ways of moving things around. But as I mentioned before, Maya also allows you to move things in different ways as well. In the channel box itself, I can actually type values in here as well. So if I type in a value of 10 in the y-axis, it's going to move up. If I type in -10, it's going to move down like this. So you can very precisely move things by typing in numbers if you so needed to. Another very cool feature is if I click on the channel box in a specific name of a property, like translate Y, one of the things you can do is you can middle mouse button drag on the viewport, and that will actually allow you to spin the number up and down interactively, allowing you to move something one click at a time. Again, it's choosing the name of the channel, translate X, and you can move things left and right by middle mouse clicking with the mouse and dragging left and right on your surface. Now, if you completely make a mistake, there's never a problem in Maya. If you run out of undos or anything else like that, there's very easy ways of resetting things, and that's where the channel box is really powerful. If I take the translate X, Y, and Z values, click and drag on them, and type in the number 0, now it's going to allow me to type in the value 0 in all of the boxes that I have selected. So if I press enter and put those numbers back down to 0, 0, 0, my type is going to jump straight to where it was in its origin position, which is what all those zeros actually mean. That's the origin of the scene, the default value where this text was created, which is really useful for orienting yourself when you're moving around a scene. Now that is the Move tool. There's another one that I want to introduce you guys that's going to be very similar, but it's going to have a slightly different design. I'm just going to make the transform gizmo a little bit bigger on my screen by pressing the plus key. And what I'm going to do is now go to the rotate tool, which is this one over here. No surprises here, it's going to do what it says on the tin. But I'm going to ask you guys to look at clicking very precisely on this new transform gizmo that we've got, which is like a 3D sphere if I move it around my screen like this. So if I grab the x-axis, which is the red one over here, I'm going to drag this up and down, and I'm rotating in just one axis by itself, like this. And wherever I drop that, there we go. If I press Ctrl Z, you can see that I can move things always one axis at a time like that, and I can orient my 3D text by rotating it in 3D space. Again, pressing Ctrl Z, pressing on the circles and dragging will rotate the text in one axis at a time. Now, what happens if I missed the line and I just clicked in the middle? Well, I get this new type of rotation, which I'm just moving my mouse or my pen around on my tablet, and you'll see that I get this very weird free-form type of rotation. If you look at the channel box, you'll also see that all 3 axes are spinning at the same time in the rotate channels, which are over here. Now, this sometimes can be very good to create things that are slightly offset from the camera, or things that you don't want to be perfectly geometrically aligned, but most of the time you actually should be rotating things from the axes. Now there's a third tool in the transform gizmo, which as I spin around is this golden ring that goes around the outside over here. And if I rotate this, I get a very similar type of movement to what I had with the move tool, which is actually that this object is now spinning according to my camera. So this little circle actually allows me to move my view around like this, and I can rotate objects parallel to the camera plane again. So really easy ways of actually rotating things around in space. And all of the other values of typing things in and middle mouse clicking on a value on the rotation channel will allow you to do the same thing as the move tool as well. Now one more thing that I need to introduce to you guys is the third tool, which is the scale tool. Now scale is mostly used for changing the size of an object. If I think that this 3D object is too big and I want to make it smaller, the best way of doing that is clicking in the middle of the actual scale tool. And that little box in the middle is going to allow me to make my type larger and fill more of the screen, or smaller and fill less of the screen, like this as well. Now, it's important that there are also these axes, and if you look very closely, there's also some plane constraints as well for the tool, very much the same as the move tool. Now, what happens if I grab a single axis, like this x-axis over here, and I drag that one axis by itself? Well, it's actually going to like stretch or squash my type, but in one specific direction like that. Let's say I wanted some fatter type like that, and I wanted to squash it down like that. There we go. You're basically making a scale in one specific direction. Now what happens if I want to scale things in a particular plane? Well, here my text is going to get fatter and longer at the same time as it moves in the planes on the ground. However, if I grab the plane here on the side, you're going to see that my text looks like it's getting larger, but it's actually still really thin, because I'm constraining that scale to the y and x plane. If you don't believe me, I'm just going to click in the middle over here, and you're going to see that as the object scales from the middle, it actually also gets wider in the z-axis over here. So that's very useful for us to actually be able to create objects of different size and manipulate them. Now, most of the time, I'm not using these buttons over here. And the reason for that is because I know the keyboard shortcuts to them. These type of operations you do so many times in Maya that it really pays off to know the keyboard shortcuts. And those are actually tied to the top of your keyboard to the letters W, E, and R. So W on the keyboard is the move tool. E is the rotate tool over there, and R is the scale tool, like that. Perfect. So if you have your hand, your left hand, on W, E, and R all the time, you can very quickly cycle through all of these tools and perform operations quickly and efficiently. And if you ever make a mistake, Control Z is just one movement away, and your Alt key will allow you to move around your scene like so, which is really handy. Again, now I've made loads of changes. How can I finally reset everything so it's exactly the same as it used to be before? Now, I want you guys to pay attention because I'm going to go into the channel box, and for the translate values, I'm going to change the values to 0. And that's going to move my type right back to the middle of my scene. I'm then going to take the X, Y, and Z values for the rotate and change those to 0 as well. And that's now going to put my 3D type rotated in the correct direction as it was at the beginning. What about the scale? Well, what happens if I come into scale and turn it to 0? Well, my object disappears because now it's kind of like being constrained down to a tiny point. Scale is a little bit different. If you want the original scale of an object, it's the full value of 1. That's how you actually get your object to be its original size. So the default values for everything are 0 for the rotate and translation, and the scale is a value of 1 on every axis. And that is almost like doing a manual way of Control Z, because sometimes you just run out of how many steps you go back. Now that we've got this sorted out, the last thing that I want to point out to you guys is a little bit of knowledge of how do I know in which direction these objects are actually going in. Well, there's a very important little tip, which is that in 3D graphics, the X, Y, and Z values are tied to specific colors. You may have heard from maybe Photoshop or another program of imagery, the values RGB, which are the colors that we use for all of our screen graphics. Well, R maps to X, Y maps to green, and Z maps to blue. RGB, X, Y, Z. And this is a common language for every piece of 3D software out there. If you're using 3ds Max, Maya, Blender, they all use this same type of thinking, although there are a few little differences between them, as I'm sure you know. So after we've talked about creating something, and we've learned the basic viewport navigation controls and the manipulation tools, it's important for us to go ahead and start now modifying the properties of this type. So now that we've learned how to navigate around in the viewport, create an object, and use the basic manipulation tools to move, rotate, and scale, it's a good time to think about workflow. And one very, very, very important thing in Maya is to save constantly. Maya, like most 3D programs, tends to have errors sometimes, or sometimes the program gets confused. It's very easy for the software to crash. And it's more important to also learn how to save multiple versions of your work, because there is a possibility that your scenes might corrupt and maybe you might not be able to open that 3D file. Now that might seem a little bit scary and intimidating, but I'm going to show you a few things to make sure that that doesn't happen and that you can go ahead and work in Maya as smoothly as you possibly can. So just before we save, I'm going to go into File and scroll down in the menu and look for something called Project Window down here near the bottom. Now, the project window is Maya's way of setting up a folder structure where your project is going to be saved. I recommend to most people, especially beginners, to work with a folder structure, either by Maya, or if you're more advanced, to build one yourself and to actually tell Maya where you want things to be saved. Now, it's important for us that when we're creating a new project, that this is just going to be a series of folders. So I'm going to click on New, because I'm going to create a new project. And what I'm going to do is give this project a name. And that name is going to be my first Maya scene. There we go. And then I'm going to go onto my hard drive, and on my desktop over here, I'm going to go ahead and look for a folder which I've called My Tutorials over here. Inside of here, I just have to click on the folder I want to save, and that will create a folder inside called My First Maya Scene, and it will also create all of these subfolders over here for my scene files, my movie files, my images, which will hold my textures and other 3D information. And when I hit accept, that's going to create all of that folder structure for me. Now I'm doing that first because now I'm going to come into File, Save Scene As over here, and that's now going to go directly to that project folder that I just set up, where Maya is going to go into my desktop, my tutorials, my first Maya scene, and inside my scenes folder is where my Maya files are going to be saved. Now Maya has two flavors of save files, one which is called Maya Binary and one which is called Maya ASCII. Now, depending on your pipeline or the people you're working with, people might ask you to save in one or these other files. But I recommend for students, particularly, to work with the Maya ASCII file, just because it saves your Maya file as a text file, and that can allow you to sometimes debug and save a few errors. And I'll talk to you guys maybe about some tips that you can do in future as well. So I'm going to give this a descriptive name, and that name is going to be my text scene, like that. Now, just before I finish, I'm going to type a period or a dot 0001 to the end of that file name. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm going to use a feature inside of Maya that is going to allow me to save iteratively. So after I've saved this first version, version 1 of my file, I hit Save As, and Maya will go ahead and save that onto my hard drive as a Maya ASCII file. Now, if I just come over here and make a very subtle change over here and just move that to a side, I could be working on this for a few minutes. What I tend to do is not use the file Save Scene option over here, that good old Control Z or Command Z if you're on a Mac. What I tend to use is Shift Control S over here. And that is actually the way that I would be saving things, which is this command over here, which is called increment and save. Now, when you increment and save over here, you're going to see that now Maya up here at the top has changed my scene number to to my text scene dot 0002 because it's saving a new version of my scene. So if I come into File Open over here, you're going to see that now there are two scenes inside of my scene over here, which is my text scene 001 and my text scene 002 over here. Now I've just noticed a little error over here that can happen as well. So if I go to File, Save Scene As, I'm just going to double click on one of these. Whoops, Save Scene As. Here we go. And actually I've just noticed that my MA, I actually deleted it. So that's a little problem that Maya has. Whatever you type into this box is whatever Maya will name your scene as. So actually these scenes won't open at all because they don't have the actual extension at the end of them. So I'm just going to have to do that again. So I'm going to type in my text scene dot 0001. And you're going to see that it's not even going to ask me to overwrite it because it thinks it's a separate file. That's what you get when you try to demonstrate things to people, that little things go wrong, but I want to keep these things in here for you guys so that you guys actually learn as well from the little mistakes that even somebody who's been using Maya for years can make when he tries to show off what he's doing. So, coming back to my scene, now that it's saved and I'm ready to do iterative saves, I'll probably try and save at every major milestone that we hit over here. So when we're going to do some modeling, I'm going to go ahead and save. When I do my texturing, I'm going to save again. You should get into the habit of saving frequently and saving incrementally. And if I remember the keyboard shortcut correctly, that should be Control, Shift, and S, or Command, Shift, and S if you're on a Mac like myself. So what we're going to do is I'm going to now start editing some of the properties of this type. And to do that, I'm going to go into another panel, which I can reach pressing Control A or clicking on the attribute editor here on the side. Now the attribute editor stores specific properties about the object that I have selected. If I click off my scene, you see that the attribute editor empties, and here Maya has the habit of working in two specific ways. There are Maya nodes in these little tabs at the top. They're like things that you can add to your 3D object, and then all of the properties are listed in a menu that goes down the page over here. You actually see I just tapped over here and I can go either through the tabs or scrolling through the actual menus over here. Now if I go into the node that says type 1, that is what's going to allow me to select this text box over here and change what my 3D type says. And because I'm a big movies and comics book fan as well, I'm going to choose a very simple character over here, and I'm going to type the word Iron Man inside of my scene, just because I really love the Robert Downey Jr. movies. And what I'm going to do is also change the typeface of this type over here as well. And now in Maya 2017, we've got a really nice type tool, which gives us even a preview of what the type or fonts look like inside of this little preview window. All of the fonts that you have installed on your computer or that you can download off the internet, you can now use inside of Maya for the purpose of making motion graphics and loads of other things as well. So I'm going to look for a font that should be available both on a Macintosh and on a PC as well. It's a very common font, but it will work great for this example, and that's a font called Impact. And you can see that that really does fit the type of theme for what I'm going for here. Properly well-written Iron Man like that. Now, there's also some other properties down here, and Maya's introducing more and more sliders inside of its interface in 2017, which is allowing me to actually change things like the size of the font directly in here. I can also change the spacing in between the individual letters by changing the tracking property over here, and I can also change the kerning as well, which is going to allow me to get that my letters like really close, even bunched up to one another. So I might just make that a little bit tighter like that, not so tight that the A goes into the M over here, so I'm going to keep a little bit of space like that, but you can do some basic manipulations like this. Now, what do I want to do? Well, currently my type is a little bit too thin, so I'm going to go into the next tab inside of the type tool, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for a little drop-down menu over here which is called Mesh Settings. Pay attention to the little arrows here because those define if a menu is open or if it is closed. So there might be some hidden properties that you might just miss if you're not reading down this long list inside of the attribute editor. So if I open Mesh Settings over here and I scroll down, where are we? There's this property over here called Extrude Distance. And extrude distance is going to allow me to make my type thicker or thinner, almost like using a Z-scale with the transform tool that I showed you before. So I'm just going to make the type a little bit thicker, like that. And up here, if you've got a very round type of type as well, you might want to change the resolution of the image as well. You'll see that in the mesh settings, if I give it a very low resolution, my text looks very blocky, but as I add more subdivisions over here with this curve resolution slider, it's going to get nicer and rounder. Now, it's important for you guys to, whatever tutorial you're doing, you can write whatever word you fancy. Everything that I'm going to show you here is going to work for most words. The only advice I'd give you guys is try not to use a typeface that's too handwritten. It might bring up a few problems of meshes intersecting and other stuff as we go manipulating it, but I think it should work as long as you're careful in changing your settings over here. So write whatever you want on your screen and follow along like this. Now, I've got my mesh settings set up over here. There's another menu that I'm going to open later, which is called Deformable Type, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the next menu that we need to go for is the one right at the bottom over here, which is called Bevels. Now, Maya, every time we open one of these up, you need to move the little slider here on the side by left-clicking and dragging, and you're going to have to be opening up a few more menus. The type of bevel I want to use is an inner bevel, and that inner bevel will have its own properties for front bevel and back bevel. I'm happy to just use the front bevel, but feel free to turn both of them on if you want. And I will turn on this little tick box that says Enable Front Bevel. And it's made a tiny change inside of my scene. Let me just go over here. I just right-clicked a little bit too much on my scene over there, and I just brought up one of the contextual menus that Maya has. So inside here, what it's done is that it's created a little fillet here at the end. So if I come down here, this little bevel has a few properties which are useful to me. If I scrub over here, you'll see that I can actually make that bevel larger or smaller. So I'm just going to drag it up a little bit more to about 0.8 in my scene. You might have a different value over here. And inside the bevel offset property over here, I'm going to drag it up, and you'll see that it locks out at 1. Now, one important thing about the sliders inside of Maya is that they're normally not locked sometimes to a specific value. And if I wanted to type in here a value of 4, which is beyond the value of that slider, it's going to allow me to make that bevel a lot larger, like this. One of the cool things as well is that we've got this curve profile over here, which if we look at the side of the bevel, we can see that it actually is a curve. And if I wanted a straight bevel, I can click on this value over here from larger to smaller, and it's going to create a nice little bevel like that, which if I just click off my text for a second, that bevel, all that it's going to give me is a lovely edge on the side of the text, which is going to allow the light to bounce off that and make it look even cooler than it is right now. So I've got a nice blocky heavy typeface. I've got a little bit of editing 3D geometry over here, which is my type, and all I need to do now is create a background for my type. So what am I going to do? I'm going to press the little plane over here button inside of the shelf, or I can go into Create, go down to Polygon Primitives, and look for an object called Plane. Now by default, Maya creates all of the objects inside it right on the 0, 0, 0 origin of our scene over here. So I've got this little tiny plane that has appeared right there in my scene. And Maya will basically ask me to go ahead and to use my scale tool by either clicking the button or pressing R on your keyboard and scaling this plane up. I'm going to be making a background over here, which is why it's important for me to get familiar with using the move, rotate, and scale tools like such. If I bring up the rotate tool and rotate this in the x-axis, I could type in a value of 90 degrees inside of my scene like that. But another quick keyboard shortcut that you can choose to use as well is that if you press down J on your keyboard and drag, it's going to drag your rotations in increments of about 15 degrees. So you can very easily get all the way up to 90 degrees. And I think it's probably 30 degrees, not 15, but you can change that number inside of your Maya settings as well. So now I've got myself a background. I have myself my Iron Man text over here, and modeling is primarily creating 3D objects and manipulating them. Now, because I'm going really quick here and I don't want to spend a lot of time with you guys showing you very complex modeling in this tutorial and very complex lighting and very complex texturing, we'll get to those. What we're doing is just doing very, very, very basic things so that you guys can create a very simple 3D scene and you feel that you're actually understanding how to use the tools without trying to be too complex. So even though this is not professional modeling by any means, it definitely is a good way for you guys to practice those bare basic skills that you need to have in order to get good with Maya. So this is going to be the basis for my scene. But there is one last thing that I need to do over here, and this is a purely technical manipulation. Inside of my attribute editor, again, we can press Ctrl A to get to that, or click on the tab over here on the side. One of the important things that I have is that up here at the top, there's this menu called Deformable Type. Now, I'm going to be rendering this type out through Arnold, and because of the way that Arnold's going to render this typeface out and the way that this is created, I need to turn on this option called Deformable Type. I could change the settings down here, but just so that you guys know, this is going to subdivide, create lots of little polygon faces inside of my typeface. And this is going to help us to actually render this out. Now, this is a specific problem that I've tracked down inside of Arnold, but if you do not turn on this deformable type option over here, you might see some errors inside of your renders at the end. So just make sure for today that is turned on. And this is probably now taken this modeling into the worst possible scenario that it could be, because there's so much geometry inside of these scenes. But you're learning. You'll make mistakes like this and you'll keep going. Okay, So now that we've done some modeling, let's go ahead and start thinking about texturing. And texturing is adding color and surface detail to our 3D objects to make them look like the materials that they should look like according to what we're doing. So to create textures, I need to introduce you guys to another tool inside of Maya, which is a whole new interface in and of itself, and that's called the Hypershade. You can find the Hypershade either by going into Windows, Rendering Editors, and Hypershade, or if you look very closely at this blue icon, you'll see that we have a button up here for the Hypershade as well. Now, it's important when we're doing any type of texture work that we are aware of what renderer we are using, and actually we change this material viewer property over here to Arnold, which is now the default renderer inside of Maya 2017. Now, the Hypershade contains a workspace over here and a list of the materials that are currently available inside of my scene by default. Now, because we have Arnold, we have a specific Arnold shader for creating textures, and that is called an AI standard shader, which I'm going to type in here, the first 3 letters of it, and you'll see that I get this little item over here called an AI standard material. Now, what a material is a way of describing a specific surface of how it works. And Maya tends to refer to them as shaders. So this shader over here will have different properties based on what settings I input down here. This shader that I'm going to create, I'm just going to create something that I'm going to call a matte material. A material that's kind of like a sheet of paper or a painted wall. It doesn't reflect a lot of light. So I'm going to call that matte. I'm going to open up this color picker over here, and I'm going to choose a dark bluish type of color over here. And you'll see that as I update this little preview window over here is showing me a representation of what that material will actually look like. So this would be my matte material, just changing it to a dark blue color. Now, there's currently nothing still in my scene, but I'm going to create another texture over here. So what I'm going to do is, again, double click on this menu item over here for AI standard to create a new AI standard material. In the property editor over here, I've got the basic settings like this, and I'm going to change this one to be a brightish orange type of color, somewhat like this. Now, what I want to do is I want to rename this object over here as glossy, and I want to make a material that is actually an orange reflective type of material, something like a shiny plastic or maybe copper, for example. What I'm going to do is come down to my specular over here property, which is down here, double click on the color options over here, which I think are just hidden behind my window, like so. I'm just going to give it a little bit of an orange tint to that white over there. Now, the next thing that I want to do is boost up the weight value over here. And the weight is going to show that this material over here is going to be very, very, very reflective. So if I change the weight to a value of 1, I've got a highly reflective material. If I play around with the roughness, that's going to, if I turn the roughness all the way down to 0, you're going to see that that's a very sharp, very shiny material, almost like looking at a snooker ball or something that's made out of old-fashioned glossy plastic. And the more roughness I add to it, you're going to see the more diffuse that specular highlight is going to be. So I'm going to turn it down fairly down, but maybe I'll just turn it to 0.1. So I've only changed 3 properties inside of these sliders, and that's completely changed the look that this texture has right here. So I've created a very simple material by changing the colors of the diffuse property, which is the base color, the specular, changing maybe the color a little bit, but it's importantly changing the weight of the specular to 1 and the roughness to 0.1, just so that it's not perfectly reflective. So with those settings set, I now have created two materials, cunningly named matte and glossy over here, and that is going to be the materials that I apply now to my scene in my viewport. Now, how can I get my textures from the Hypershade into the viewport is very simple. I'm going to show you three ways of doing it. The first way that I can do this is I can middle mouse button drag from the material swatch up here onto my viewport. And on a Macintosh, you'll see I get a little green plus icon like this, and I drop it, and hey presto, I've just applied the matte material to the background of my scene like this. Really easy. There's another way of doing it, which involves if I select an object inside of my 3D scene by using the arrow tool or the move, rotate, and scale tool, like so, I can then right-click inside the material editor, and I'll get a little contextual menu which should appear like this, and that will allow me to actually drag. You've got to keep your right click pressed for this to work, and you'll see that there's this button up here that says Assign Material to Selection. So as I drag upwards, the Assign Materials to Selection will highlight, and that will apply the texture to my text, like so. I'm just going to undo that for a second because I want to show you the third way of doing this. Inside of my viewport, without even necessarily having my Hypershade open, I can right-click, and these contextual menus, when you right-click and hold your right-click, also exist inside of the viewport, and they show you specific tools based on where your mouse is positioned. So as I'm on text, it's opening all of the options that are available for a polygonal object inside of my scene. If I scroll down to the bottom over here, you'll see that there's this little menu item which is called Assign Existing Material. And inside there, I have a list in text of all of the materials that were up here. So renaming things inside of Maya is really useful because it allows me to find this glossy material instantly rather than looking at shader 1 to shader 4000 that you might have in your scene. So really quickly like that, we've created some basic shaders inside of Maya. And again, shaders are always specific to the type of renderer or the type of game engine that you might be working with. Texturing is not only about color, it's also about surfaces. But we can't really see the surface detail until we start actually lighting our scene, which is what we're going to do next. It's another good time to do a quick increment and save to change the version of the file that we're actually working with. And now we're going to start creating some lights. Now, the great thing about Maya 2017 is that we've got Arnold as our default renderer, and Arnold is great at replicating real-world lighting and creating complex lighting effects. We're not going to have enough detail to go into everything that Arnold can do today, but trust me, that tutorial is coming soon. What I want to show you guys very briefly is how to create lights inside of Maya. And if you've used a version of Maya before, you should be very comfortable with going into the Create panel, Lights, and I'm just going to click on this little bar at the top to tear off this panel, and these are all of the Maya default lights which exist over here. However, now in Maya 2017, we also have a whole menu dedicated to Arnold, and inside this Arnold menu there is also a lights panel over here. Hopefully these should be integrated at some point in the future. So this lights menu over here, I'm just going to tear it off, are lights that are specific to Arnold. Now first of all, Arnold is very user-friendly with all of the traditional Maya lights. All of these lights will now have a little Arnold tab inside of the attribute editor, which will display the properties for the traditional lights with Arnold settings. But these lights down here are specific. These four at the top, the area light, the sky dome, the mesh light, the photometric light, are all specific lights to Arnold, and they will work great for creating the lighting setup that we're going to do. So instead of using a Maya area light, make sure you're using the Arnold area light. And I'm going to click on this area light over here, and the only thing that an area light is it's a little rectangular type of light like this. It'll come in as an icon like this, which if I scroll over here and move this back a little bit like that, you'll see that it's just a little rectangular shape like this. Again, this is where the move, rotate, and scale tool come in really handy, because they're going to allow me to move and scale things reasonably quickly inside of my interface. So if I come over here, I'm going to use the scale tool to make this area light roughly the size of my scene, of my text. And what you're going to see is that there's no lighting turned on inside of the interface. Now, one of the important things that we have to be aware of is that Maya turns off a lot of features when we're working in the viewport to save resources. If I click this little light bulb icon over here, these are the viewport filters. And if I turn on this light over here, you'll see that there's a very crude representation of what this light should actually look like inside of my scene. What an area light actually looks like is a bit more of like a softbox that you might encounter inside of photography. But if I want to see the effects of the light, I might have to come up here into the render panel and click on the render window over here. And you'll see that now Maya's running through with Arnold and it's rendering out my scene like that. It looks pretty dark, as you can see. How can I change the intensity of the light? Because currently it's too low, which is why I can't see anything in my scene. Well, traditionally in Maya Lights, we're using a property called intensity, and this still works, but you have to type in some very large values in here for the scene to start lighting up. Arnold uses a property called exposure to help us with this, and if I change my exposure to a value of 12, for example, and push the render button again, which I can do on the screen of this viewport, you're going to see that I start having some lighting appearing inside of my scene just like that. Now, you'll notice something here, which is that these two views do not match. Sometimes in some scenes they do, and other times they don't. But don't trust that the lighting that you see in the Maya viewport is going to be the same as the lighting that you see in the final rendered view. Because to help with this, actually Arnold has its own render view as well, which if I open it very briefly, I won't go into a lot of detail, but this will be a much more precise way of looking at how the lighting works inside of your scenes. I'm going to close that for now to keep it simple with the older Maya interface over here. And what I'm going to do is choose the rotate tool. I'm going to kill my preview of my light in my scene since it's not doing much for me. And I'm going to rotate this light 90 degrees like that with the help of the J key. Then I am going to position the light so that it is just above my text like that, and hopefully not touching the background plane just like that. So I'm going to have a light from up high like this, which should be shining down on my text. And I'm going to do a very quick test render over here. So I should see that my type is starting to light up just like that. And the great thing about an area light is that it creates these very, very, very soft shadows like that as light scatters out in all separate directions. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to maybe increase the exposure to 14, and hopefully that shouldn't be too much. One of the quick things that you can do is that you can turn on this little eye with a clapperboard icon over here, which will bring up your previous render view. And if I click and drag on my interface like this, and I'll get this little rectangle, it will allow me to render out just whatever is inside this render region. I always forget to push the right button, and that's in these buttons over here, which is the clapperboard inside of the blue rectangle over here. And that will now save me a little bit of time because it's not going to render out my entire scene. Another thing to note is that there's going to be some grainy light noise inside of the Arnold renderer over here, and that's because we're rendering at a very low quality right now. Later on, for our final image, we're going to boost the quality of the samples inside of Arnold just to make it render properly and with none of this noise over here. So what I'm going to do, very briefly, is close this window. I've got my first light in place, and what I'm going to do, because I'm going to make a very quick lighting setup, is I'm going to use Command D or Control D, if you're on a PC, to duplicate this light. So make sure you have the light selected, and you'll see that you can duplicate a light just like this. And what I'm going to do is position this light roughly in the middle of the text, use the Rotate tool, pressing J to constrain it to a 90-degree turn like that, and then I'm going to move this light over to the side like this, and then I'll scale it down so that it's a little bit narrower, just a little bit larger than the text like that. And then I might just rotate it so that it faces towards the text like that. There we go. Now the next thing I'm going to do is change the properties of this light just a little bit inside the attribute editor again. So I'm going to change the exposure of this light down to 12, and I'm going to turn on a tick box property here, which is called Use Color Temperature. And that's going to change my light to have a bit of a blue tint to an extent at 6500 Kelvin. The next thing I'm going to do is duplicate this light again. I'm going to create a light on the other side over here. So I'm going to press Command D again, or Control D if you're on a PC. And if I change to the transform gizmo over here, I should hopefully be able to move this light in the x-axis. Looks like I didn't duplicate it. There we go. Command D or Control D, there we go, and then I will choose the Rotate tool, and I'll rotate it roughly so that it's pointing somewhat in the same direction like this. Again, in Arnold's interactive view, using the Arnold viewer, we could see these changes in real time, but because I'm on a laptop right now, I'm just saving myself that little bit of processing power just so that I can do things a little bit quicker for you guys. So if I come over here now and I start looking at the effects of this light, I should see that I'm starting to light the text up like so. And importantly for us, you're going to start seeing some nice highlights coming towards the text like this. I might have to rotate my lights a little bit further and move them around so that they're pointing towards the type like this. So I'm moving them just a little bit further away, hoping that they'll get some nice reflections like that. And on this light on the right, I'm going to change the color temperature down a little bit, and you should see that I should start getting a slightly orange color. Let's see what happens if I bring the intensity of both of the lights on the side to a value of, let's say, 13, like this, and hopefully that should give me a reasonably simple lighting setup like this. So I'm going to come over here so that my Iron Man text fills most of the screen like that. There we go. Maybe zoom out just a little bit, and now I'm going to render this view over here like so. And there we go. I've got some nice soft shadows. I've got some nice highlights coming from the lights on the side. And thanks to the bevel that I've got in the actual modeling, that is areas of the type are actually catching the light which is coming from the sides. And here I can see that my light is just a little bit too close or too intense to my scene. One of the cool things about area lights is we can always move them around a little bit or make them less intense. I'm going to check if this is a position problem or a intensity problem over here. And what I might want to do is just maybe move this light a little bit to the side on the x-axis over here. And I'm just going to look at this section of the render over here. I might have to take a slightly larger chunk because I've just rendered this out like that. And there we go. I can see that even though the size has changed, if I come in a little bit closer, I should hopefully be fine. Let's just do a quick test render again. And you'll see that constantly you're going to be making little changes like that, but I just hope that that little bright part, which is on the right-hand side, is not going to be there anymore. So fingers crossed. Let's see if just moving the light to the side changes that highlight for the better. There we go. So again, very simple thing. Sometimes you just have to change the position of your lights. Now, this is not great lighting because I've done it in just a few seconds, but it's definitely starting to look interesting. Now, The next thing I want to do is let's add a little bit of animation to this scene. But before I do that, I'm going to go into File, Increment and Save again, and save another version now that I've finished my lighting. I'm going to close down these floating menus over here, so they'll be tucked away back where they came from, and then I'm going to select my text and I'm going to look for the type node again. Now there's many different ways to animate inside of Maya, but inside of Maya 2017's type tool, we have an animation tab over here, which is going to allow me to create some very basic animations for my type, or I can make some very complex animations as well. I'm going to show you very quickly how to take a piece of type inside of Maya and animate it, just to have it moving on the screen. I'm going to tick the animate option inside of the animation tab to bring up the animation properties. And the animation properties inside of here are going to allow me to move different parts of my type in translation, rotation, and scale. So for example, if I rotated the type over here, I can rotate it in different ways. Say for example, if I took, let's say, the y-axis and I rotated it 30 degrees, you're going to see that all the letters in my word are going to rotate round in 30-degree increments like that. If I wanted, I could also move them. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start my text off the screen and have it drop down into my scene. Now, how can I do that? Well, I normally create animations by using this property which is called set keys. And keys are just keyframes that are like little bookmarks inside of my scene. Down here at the bottom of the screen, I have my animation playhead. And this animation playhead is what's going to allow me to create animations. You'll see that it's a little gray box that I can drag along, and these are frame numbers over here. And this little timeline also has a little playhead, which if I press play, you're going to see that it plays through my timeline like that. And it's almost like a video that currently is not doing anything because we've not created any movement or any animation. There is also a start range for my frame, which is at frame 1, and an end range, which is 120. So there's 120 frames in my scene over here. I'm not going to need that many. I'm actually going to knock this down, and I'm going to create a very short animation of just 72 frames because it's going to be a lot faster to render. The thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the timeline and scrub down to frame, let's say, 30. And on frame 30, I'm going to push this button here which says Set Keys. You're going to see that all these properties highlight red, and that's going to mean that I have created a keyframe on frame 30. This is like a bookmark, which basically says I want my text to be at 000 on frame 30. Then I'm going to come back in time to frame 15 over here, and I'm going to change a parameter. And that parameter is going to be, I'm going to use the translate property, and I'm going to give it a value of, let's say, 100. And let's see where that text actually goes over here. And I'm going to press set key again. And it looks like my text has disappeared, but it's actually flown off upwards in the y-axis up my scene like that. So make sure you put 100 in the second box over here. Now if I scrub through time over here, it looks like, there we go, Maya, almost by act of magic, has started to create some animation. But currently it's longer by default than the whole length of my scene. Now I can do loads of other things to this as well, but what I'm going to do is come back to frame 15 over here. And the thing that I'm going to do is use this delay drop-down menu over here to reduce the number of frames that are in between each one of the letters. I'm actually going to give it just 3 frames like that. And this is that the I is going to start moving, and 3 frames later, the R is going to start moving, and then the O, then the N, and you're going to see that they drop down in a more concise manner like that. People who've used Maya 2016 before, if you actually want to select the actual keyframes which are on each one of these letters, inside of the timeline, there's a select button down here, which if I click on it, you'll see these little red bars appear on frame 15 and on frame 30, which will basically allow us to manipulate things in a traditional manner. And I'll show you a little bit more about animation in future videos, and there's a whole host of animation videos on the channel as well that you guys can enjoy from today. Work pretty much exactly the same as in my previous versions of Maya. So if I press play over here, I should see that the Iron Man text drops in there fairly quickly, fairly heavily, and now I'm almost ready to go to render. When we're rendering out in Maya, we can choose to render a single frame or to render a whole sequence of frames inside of Maya to create an animation. Now, Maya only renders frames, is single images that it will create as JPEG files, OpenEXR files. It doesn't really create videos. You're going to have to use a editing piece of software like Premiere, QuickTime Pro, After Effects to take all of those images and turn them into an image sequence that then you can turn into a final video. However, it's very important for us to think as 3D artists that we always want to render out our images at the best quality possible. And to check that we're rendering out at a correct size and in a good manner, what we have is to check the render settings, which is this little clapperboard with a blue gearbox in its bottom right hand corner. Now these render settings over here tell us what renderer we actually are using, and also other important information, like for example, what's the size of my frame over here. Currently it's set to a small, kind of like half frame HD frame by default, and you can choose any other size to work with in here, or even input the pixel values into these properties over here. Now, I'm going to render out first a still image, which is what we've been doing primarily for our test renders, but you need to be aware of how to save things inside of Maya, especially now that we're using Arnold. The number one thing that we have to do is try to figure out how to make Arnold render effectively. And we have to go into the Arnold renderer settings over here. The reason why we're getting all of this noise in the previous images that we've been rendering out over here is because these render settings are just too low right now. However, as we increment the value of these render settings, our render time is going to take longer and longer. You'll see over here that Arnold is rendering with a sampling section down here of 3222222, and those numbers have a meaning, which is all tied down to these ones over here, and it took about 20 frames to render this image. It's going to take several minutes for us to be able to render out this whole sequence over here, and that's a very normal thing inside of rendering in any 3D application. However, we can help make the process maybe a little bit faster if we understand how Arnold renders. The number one thing that we need to be aware of is, for example, that here I'm not rendering a scene that has any type of glass, for example. So actually the samples of the refraction property I can change to 0. There's no subsurface scattering either over here, and there's no volume indirect either inside of this scene. I'm rendering actually out the bare basics over here, which is a diffuse class, because I had a diffuse texture over here, my matte material, and I also had a glossy material as well, which has some reflections. So I'm going to keep the diffuse and the glossy at 2. Now, Arnold, like most modern renderers, also has another property over here, which is the unified anti-aliasing, which basically means the main quality setting of the samples that are being taken of this scene. It's a little bit technical, but you have to kind of think about it in terms of the higher this number gets, the higher quality the image is going to have in terms of less noise, but it's also going to take longer to render. How high does it have to go? There's not a magic number. It varies from scene to scene. But we can see that the value of 3 here is just too low. I'm not going to go crazy with this, but I'm going to try to render out initially with a value of 8 in the upmost value. And I'm going to render this out in this view, and I'm just going to wait to see how long it takes for my scene to actually render. Okay, so I played around with the render settings, and I settled in at a value of 5, 2 for the diffuse, and 3 for the glossy, because I was seeing that there was some noise in these reflective areas over here. So Arnold allows you to be very selective about where you're adding quality, and if your renderer is not using a specific property, you can just turn it off and save yourself the render time. It's quite an interesting way of working. You'll see that the render time that I managed to get down by playing around with the settings was 35 seconds. And my original render at 8 took well over a minute and a half to render on my little laptop over here. So it's important to be efficient with your renders and try to render in as little time as possible. Making this test render over here has now possibly saved me a load of time when I want to render out an animation like so. So the next thing I want to show you is how to save an image. Now, saving an image is very simple because you can go to File, Save Image, but I want you to click on this little box over here which will open the options for saving an image. When we're saving something out in Maya, we have to make a choice, and it's purely dependent on what it is that you're doing. Most 3D artists will most of the time be saving an image that is a raw image. It will look like this. It doesn't look great to our eyes, but this image has a lot of color information, and it means that we are going to use color correction to fix any errors that there are in this image. Some people just want to render things out and take it straight to the web. And that means that they would want to have some form of a gamma curve burnt into it, or some form of tone mapping over here. This is the image I saw in my viewport. That's the image I want to put on my website. If that's the case, you want to save a color managed image so that it looks like this way. Or else Maya is going to be saving a raw image because it expects you as a 3D artist to do your own color correction later on in another package, maybe like Nuke. So if you're interested in this image, when you save things, make sure you save as a color managed image, and you hit apply and close over here, and that file should be saved inside of your project windows. What would be the settings of those files are inside the Common tab over here. So if I go into the Common tab over here, you're going to see that Maya has created an EXR, which hopefully, if I go into my Finder on my Mac and create a new Finder window and go to my desktop, my tutorials over here, my first Maya scene, and I look inside my project folder, inside the images folder over here, inside the temp file over here, I should have a saved image, so let me just check that again. I'm going to go to Save Image over here, and here we go. It brought a dialog up for me now because I hadn't saved it yet. Inside my Images folder over here, I'm going to have my first image, and currently it's saving it as an alias pics over here. I'm going to scroll down a little bit and look for a JPEG file in this case, just because this is an image that I'm thinking is going to go out for the web. I'm going to hit save over there, and there we go. It should be saved now inside here, which if I open it up in my viewer, fingers crossed, yes, it's exactly the same as the image that I see in here. Now, that's important because if we're going to render out an image to create an animation, we need to render now 72 versions of this thing over here. And I know that a lot of these frames are actually the same on the beginning and the end. It's just going to be a static form of text, and there's ways of saving time of doing that, but I'm just going to render out the whole sequence so that we're kind of like just doing it as if you were working with Maya for the first time. If you want to render out an animation sequence, you have to change some settings in the Common panel. And that would be going to save a JPEG image, again, because I want to render it out with no color correction whatsoever. I want to make sure that when we're rendering this out, I'm going to scrub down here, and I need to change a property over here which says file animation, and I'm going to change this from single frame to name number, which is what the hashtag stands for, dot extension over there. And then I have to tell Maya how many frames I want to render out. I want to render out frame 1 to frame 72. I could choose less if I'm on a less powerful or computer, but you guys should decide how much of this sequence you want to render out. And then make sure that we're rendering out the perspective camera and that all these settings are all set. Now we're all set to render an animation. What do we have to do now? Well, there's an important thing, which is that Maya hasn't got a render button for turning on an image sequence. It's got another little menu. Up here in the top left-hand corner, there's a modeling drop-down menu over here, and there is a property here called rendering. When I click on rendering, it changes the menu set that's up here to specifically work with the rendering tools. So you'll see that anything that's after the word Windows actually has a different panel over here. And inside render, there is a property over here which is called batch render. Now batch render will read the render settings and will render out as many frames as you told it to render out. Now that render setting over there, we can also have other options over here to render the current frame or the previous frame. But the batch render will be used for rendering out the actual whole image sequence. This is going to take a little bit of time, and I'm going to show you that Arnold has a specific problem when rendering out image sequences currently, as we're in September of 2016, with the current build that they've just released as their first release of Maya 2017. So let's render this out and I'll show you what the video looks like. Okay, so as you've seen from the video, there's one big problem with the current version of Maya 2017, which is although Arnold is the default renderer, when you're rendering out an animation, the images are watermarked and they've got this word Arnold all over them, which spoils a bit of the fun for most of us. And I can only imagine that Autodesk and Solidangle are probably going to come to some form of an agreement, maybe over the next 3-6 months, might be for another year. But currently, unless you own a render license for Arnold, so you've actually bought Arnold as a off-the-shelf renderer, unless you have a Arnold license, you can't render out animations that are not watermarked. That's a bit of a hard thing because that's an additional cost to you as a 3D artist to actually have to use. And for the next few months, we don't really know where this is going right now. I can only imagine that hopefully Arnold will settle in and we'll be able to have a version of Arnold that actually does render out everything, you know, on the device that you're on. But currently there's no news of which way this is going to go. So this is a bit of a shame because it really does hinder the type of work that you can do without thinking about actually professionally working. But if we're lucky, I think that probably we will be able to surpass this and get to a point where Arnold will just work exactly the same way as Mental Ray used to do, which used to render images and animation sequences without any problems. So I hope you've learned a lot today, and we've just brushed on the surface of a lot of stuff. You can go into the video and you can practice different sections of it. I'm very excited about doing more stuff with Maya 2017, and as I go learning things, I'll be talking about them. If you want to receive up-to-date posts about when these videos are going to be online, please consider subscribing to the channel. My aim is to try to get a Maya 2017 video out to you guys every week, covering basics of modeling, creating fantastic textures, how to make lighting and bring your 3D scenes to light. We're going to touch on a load of subjects, and I'm currently interested in seeing if I can get 1,000 subscribers for the site. So if you can sign up, that would be absolutely great. And if you like the video, well, give us a like, and especially stay in touch. Give me comments, leave notes in the sections below. I'm currently working with these long videos, but breaking them down into sections so that you can actually visit different areas as you go learning more. But let me know what you guys think and leave me some comments, and thanks very much for your time, and I'll be posting another video for you guys next week. So look forward to that, and I'm looking forward to see you guys too. Bye.